we can apply to our life. I'm not trying to just give you on Sunday morning something that happened 2,000 years ago as a history lesson. I'm trying to give you something that happened 2,000 years ago that will live in your life today. And I'll guarantee you this will and does. Let's start in Romans 12. It's not David, but it's a principle that is exhibited in David's life. Romans 12, beginning in verse 17 through verse 21. And the title of our lesson this morning is The Curse of Revenge. Okay? Anybody going to go home before I teach it? The curse of revenge. Because it is a curse. Verse 17. Now you talk about tough principles. Get your mind in gear as we read this. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men, if it be possible. As much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Now probably, in a physical sense, when you read that, your first statement is, that's not normal. Nobody can do that. But God doesn't expect you to live normal, but spiritual. The normal thing is for us to get revenge. You hit me, I hit you twice. You cheat me, I cheat you back. And even when sometimes we try to put this type of thing into practice, we find little ways to shortcut it. For instance, in the last part of verse 20, if your enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Preacher counseling with a lady, her and her husband had just been in a war. He said, did you ever read the scripture where the Bible says, be nice, and it would heap coals of fire on his head? She said, I couldn't find any coals of fire to heap on his head, so I hit him in the head with a skillet. No. That's a shortcut. That's not what we're looking. All of us in this auditorium this morning, I don't care who we are, desperately need this message. If I had the capacity to flash on that screen the names of everyone in this room this morning with feelings of revenge towards someone, most of us would be embarrassed. Some of you, when I dimmed the lights to flash the names, would exit. If I had a sale this morning on dolls that I guaranteed you could stick pins in and hurt somebody, I could sell them. Some of you are smiling to yourself and saying, right, and there's somebody's face in your mind. And even seeing their face in your mind makes your stomach churn. And others of you may be sitting there with some kind of a satisfied smile because you're remembering some time ago that you got revenge on somebody, and it pleases you immensely. It's a critical problem in life and in society. In the murder case we've just had in our city, the whole thing with Skelton revolved around this point. Did he get revenge? He threatened it. He said he would do it according to the witnesses. That's the point of the case. It was simply, bottom line, a revenge murder case. Is there somebody in your life that's done you wrong? A boss who promised and did not come through? A mate who walked out of your life and hurt you deeply and for no good reason? Perhaps you're looking back even to parents who not only failed you but made your life miserable while you were growing up. And many of the difficulties you have today is because of the habit and lifestyle of your parents of years ago. Maybe it was a friend you trusted who not only betrayed your trust but lied about you to someone else. And every time you think about them, your blood boils. Maybe it was a teacher when you were in school who refused to hear you out. Maybe it was in athletics, a coach that didn't understand. Maybe it's a next-door neighbor who constantly infuriates you with things that are simply not true, and maybe lies to the other people in the neighborhood. I don't know what it is, but is there someone in your life right now that you really feel like you'd like to get them back? Richard Nixon was that way. He loved to get back. Now, I'm going to read you an excerpt from some of the things that came out of the Watergate tapes, and I'm going to try, you must understand, to read this very carefully. When you're reading tapes from Richard Nixon that were made in his office, you read them very carefully, or you embarrass yourself very badly and embarrass those who are in the audience. And I don't read this, I realize that was private conversations, but I just want to give you an idea how you may think people just get revenge on lower echelons. You're simply not right. He had called into his office John Ehrlichman and what was then the Treasury Secretary, who is now Secretary of State, George Shultz. And he was saying this: yeah, one of the reasons, George, that you've got to act on that SBA, Small Business Administration guy, I don't care if he's a guy with 18 kids, is that we have no discipline in this bureaucracy. We never fire anybody. We never reprimand anybody. We never demote anybody. We always promote the beep, that beep, beep, beep. You understand that? Okay, that's one I saw in advance. Okay. This fellow deliberately did not carry out the order I personally gave. I wrote the order out for him, and he deliberately did not do it. And then he spends a couple of paragraphs giving him Hail Columbia. And let him roll. And that as a warning to a few other people around this government, that we're going to quit being a bunch of so forth. I think you've got to do it. And then on down he says, I know the pressure, but you can do a lot there too. There are many unpleasant places where civil service people can be sent. We just don't have any discipline. This should not have happened. It's a terrible thing, and et cetera on. And then down here at the bottom he says, demote him or send him to Guam, the Guam Regional Office. There's a way. Get him out. And he said up in the beginning, I don't care if he's got 18 kids. We're going to get him back for what he did. From the president on down to all of us, revenge is something we must deal with. Now, we excuse these feelings of revenge by saying, it's my right to feel the way I did, didn't they? And they can explain it to me. Didn't they do me wrong? And I could say, yes, they did you wrong. Don't I have a right to get revenge? No, you don't. We say it's justifiable retaliation, or that most idiotic of all statements, and some of you may use it, but if you do, you need to quit. I don't get mad, I get even. Somebody said that to me the other day, not about me, but about somebody. Just remember, I don't get mad, I get even. No, you don't get even, and that's not your right nor responsibility. God said in these verses we read, never, ever, under any circumstances, do you as a Christian get back at anyone. Now, if I were writing the Bible, I'd say usually you shouldn't do it, but there are some cases you ought to bust them in the mouth. But I didn't write it, and God said, never do it. Now, we're not talking about things like civil defense. Obviously, this nation has responsibilities to defend herself. I have done considerable reading in World War II, and I think that war was, what do you do after a Pearl Harbor? You defend yourself. And I'm concerned today about national defense. I don't personally trust the Russians. I think if we're weak, they'll stomp us in the ground. I think it's one of their avowed purposes of life to destroy our system of democracy, and I don't trust them, and I think we ought to have a strong national defense. Nor are we talking in this issue about protecting your home. If someone breaks into your home, I think you have a right and a responsibility to protect your home. I'm not talking about someone who attacks you as a mugger or someone like that you're just to stand and let them beat your head off. I'm not talking about that, and you know I'm not talking about that, but I want to make sure you don't use that. I'm not talking about standing up for that which is right. I'm talking about someone who has mistreated you, done a personal offense to you, God said, you don't get revenge. Notice verse 18. And Paul said it twice so strongly. If it be possible. All right, statement 2. As much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. What Paul is saying is this. You can't control the other person, but you can control yourself. And you don't get on their level. And you don't retaliate in kind. Live peaceable as much as in you is with all men. Look at verse 19. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves. That is a term that allows you no leeway. He doesn't give you any circumstances. He doesn't say, except they've done this. He just says, avenge not yourselves. Give place. Understand wrath. Cool it down. Get yourself under control and leave it to God. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore. Now, as I've told you several times, when you see a therefore in the Bible, look and see what it's there for. Because it is not your responsibility nor your right, and it's your commandment not to do it to get revenge. Paul said, rather, if your enemy hungers, feed him. If he thirsts, give him drink. Verse 21, don't be overcome of evil. Don't let it ferment in your heart. Don't let a bitter root grow. Bitterness is the only emotion in the Bible that God says can take root in your life. And the Bible talks about the root of bitterness. If you get something in your mind and in your heart and it just stays there and it seeds and you build upon it, it'll take root in your heart and you can't get it out. So he said, don't be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, most of us generally go through a process, and I'm in it. Well, I'm not preaching to you. I'm preaching to us. We get injured. Somebody does us wrong. Then we sometimes look for a place where we can find them vulnerable. And then because we are depraved people, we get back. If someone has said something about us that's not true, we find a case where we can just say, well, let me tell you something about them. Or somebody at the job has put in something that's hurt you, and as soon as you get a chance, splat. God said, don't do it. I told those group of kids in Massachusetts the other night, the reason this world does not take our Christianity serious is because our Christianity lives just the same way as they live. I told them about a communist student that came to America, and when he went back to his communist nation, a reporter asked him, what is the greatest thing that impressed you about this country? And he said, my greatest impression of America was that I could tell absolutely no difference between those who said they were Christians and those who were not. You see, Christians get our revenge, our pound of flesh. I don't get mad, I get even, just like the world. And the world watches us and says, who needs it? I'm just like them now. Now, one of the great classic cases in the Bible of this is David. Let's go back to 1 Samuel chapter 23, which is our lesson series. 1 Samuel chapter 23. Now, if you've not been here over the past few weeks, would you just listen real carefully for a minute and let me bring you up to date? David was a shepherd boy who in his life, the first years, everything went really super. Just super. He loved being a shepherd. He loved the hillsides. He wrote poetry that we call psalms. He communed with nature. He communed with God. He was a boy with a beautiful spirit and a great heart and great courage and just super kid. And then one day Samuel comes into his life because God has rejected the king of Israel, whose name is Saul. He is still on the throne, but because of his disobedience to God, God's rejected him. And Samuel the prophet anoints this shepherd boy king of Israel. Now, nobody much knows it except maybe the members of his family, but God, through Samuel, has just told David, you're going to be king. Well, everything's really going good. And one day they're in a battle with the Philistines, and David comes down, and you know the story, walks down to the bottom of the valley and slays the giant Goliath. And all of a sudden everybody goes crazy over this kid. They start singing songs like, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. and he becomes the captain of Saul's army, and everything's going well, and then all of a sudden God starts dropping it off one at a time. He lost his job, lost his wife, lost Samuel, his prophet and friend. He lost Jonathan, his very best friend. Then he lost his self-respect, and we found him in the city of Gath by the Philistines, slobbering down his beard, scrabbling on the wall, acting like a crazy man. He lost his self-respect, and then last week we found him in a cave. And we talked last week about what life is like when you live it in a cave. You are spiritually and physically and emotionally on the bottom. And all of these things have happened in David's life because of one man whose name is Saul. I mean, Saul is totally responsible for every bad thing that's happened, humanly speaking. Okay? All right, let's pick it up. Living in a cave, surrounded by a group of malcontents, guys in debt, discouraged, discontented. We studied that too. 400 originally came, now it's up to 600. And David trains them into an army. But Saul is still dogging his steps. All right, chapter 23, where you are. Let's pick it up in verse 26. And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul. For Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them. But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, Haste thee and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David, and went against the Philistines. Therefore they call that place Shelah-hamath-Keloth. Great name. And David went up from hence and dwelt in the strongholds of En-gedi. Now keep in mind, Saul and the entire Israeli army are chasing David and his 600 men, and Saul doesn't care that much about those 600 men. He wants to kill David. Okay, now keep in mind, Saul had brought him in, loved him, made him captain of the host, bragged on him, and then when David became more popular than Saul, Saul tries to kill him. And all of these things are happening. So he's in En-gedi. Let me show you where that is, if I can get Bob to... I had to come in early and do this, and I couldn't. Okay, here's where En-gedi is. Let me show you on the map. The city of Gath up here, this is where David pretended to be crazy. Then he came here to Adullam last week. I'll move my pencil so you can see him. The caves of Adullam, where he and his men, huge cave, we showed you some pictures of it last week. All right, now to the strongholds of En-gedi. He has come down here by the Dead Sea. Now maybe you can see it right here. Here's En-gedi. If you're putting it in perspective, here's Bethlehem here where David was born. Here's Jerusalem right above that. The Dead Sea here, the Jordan River that flows into it. Perhaps the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, we don't know that, but the plains of Moab, we think that's where this is. Here are the strongholds of En-gedi. Now here's Masada, here at the bottom of the Dead Sea, and just above it are the strongholds of En-gedi. Let me tell you just a few things about them. They're about 600 feet above the Dead Sea. It's a very fertile area because there are springs that come out and flow down this length and make some pools and things, so there's fresh water. And it's just pockmarked with caves all around, stronghold-type caves. Also, in a moment, we're going to read sheepcotes. Let me explain that to you now. That is these places they built to keep their sheep at night or during bad weather. Remember in John 10 and in other places where Jesus talks about the shepherd and the sheep, and the shepherd bringing the sheep into the fold and counting them off, and there were only 99. What they built was a sheep cote or a sheep hold. It was a long or a building built like this. One door, they went in to the sheep. They counted them out as they went in. Several shepherds could keep their sheep in the same hold. And they recognized the voice of the shepherd and would come out at his voice. All of that's tied into the teaching of Jesus in John 10. Well, there's one of those there, but this is where David is. So he's come from Gath down to Adullam and then all the way here. We're going to the Holy Land next, early, last February, 1st of March, probably of next year. If you go with us, we're going to show you En-gedi. We're going to show you Masada and other things that you'll enjoy, okay? Lights. Okay, that's where he is. All right, now let's pick it up, chapter 24, first 3 verses. And it came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel, and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. Put that in perspective, please. The depths of this man's hatred toward David is probably beyond my ability to explain to you. But please understand, he hates him so bad it's not enough that he has stripped him of everything that's precious to a man. His family, his job, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And now he has got him hunting him. And he picks the 3,000 best soldiers in Israel and goes after David, who is just running for his life. All right, verse 3. And he came to the sheepcotes, which is what I've just explaining to you. By the way, where was a cave? And Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. Put that in perspective. Saul, with 3,000 men, excuses himself and goes in a cave, not knowing that all over the sides of that cave are David and 600 discontented, discouraged, in debt, frustrated men that David has molded into a fighting force. They must have been like the Green Berets. They were chapped. They were tough. And they're in the sides, and coming into the cave is the guy who is dealing all of them the misery. Because you remember when I talked to you a couple weeks ago, I said those guys were there because of the misery in the land of Israel, and Saul was the reason. Okay, get it in perspective. Now the Bible says in the King James Version he came in to cover his feet. In the New American Standard Version, and several of the guys I studied after approached it from this perspective, that he had gone into the cave as a force of nature to relieve himself. In fact, the New American Standard Bible says it that way. Saul went into the cave to relieve himself. This version, to cover his feet, would mean he came in to take a nap. Now, in my thinking, from what follows after this, I think taking a nap makes more sense as a result of what happens. I think had he just gone in to make a bathroom stop, what happens from here on couldn't have happened. So I believe that cover his feet. I believe he was tired and hot. He went in to take a brief nap while his army was camped outside. Okay. Let's go on. Verse 4. And the men of David said unto him. Now when Saul walks in and lays down and goes to sleep, it's like, smile, you're on candid camera. He has no idea who's in there. So the men of David talk to him. Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee. Oh, wow, what a statement that must have been. I mean, David, God has brought Saul. This is the day that God told you of, that you're going to be king. This is not our idea, David. This is God's idea. See? Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Stop there. You'll never find any place in the Bible where God ever said that to David. God never told David, I'm going to deliver Saul and give you a chance to kill him. Never said it. Who said that? His men said it. Now, I'm going to nail this down a little further in a moment, but you've got to be careful listening to your friends' advice on the things like this, because you can get lots of bad advice. But the men said, kill him. All right? Then David arose, walked toward him, and I bet those guys, I bet their hearts were beating like trip hammers, because they're saying, boy, this is going to be over. Because with Saul dead, it's over. And Saul walks up, and instead of killing him, he cuts off the skirt of Saul's robe privately. In other words, he just cut off the bottom part of his robe and walked back holding that piece of robe in his hand. Verse 5. And it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. Now, David had been given bad advice, but you understand why they gave it to him. They knew David was innocent. They knew Saul was the enemy. They knew he was vulnerable. So David cut off the skirt and came back, but his heart smote him. Verse 6, and he said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. You talk about a godly man. This is the reason, folks, nail her down. Some of you think a man after God's own heart because he's big, strong, tough. You're absolutely wrong. A man is a man after God's own heart when his heart is sensitive to the principles of God. David's heart smote him, and he said, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't even have cut off his robe. He is the Lord's anointed. It is not my business to deal with him. You say, but it was such a little thing. He just cut off his robe. May I give you another principle? Please listen. You don't get into great sin like that. You get away from God one little step at a time. You do one little thing and excuse that. And then you do something else and excuse that. And pretty soon you're doing big things that you would have never thought you'd have done back here, but you have justified yourself just a little step at a time. He cut off his robe and then he said, I shouldn't have done that. He is the king. God anointed him king. I didn't have a right to do that. His heart smote him. Peter cursed and denied the Lord, but folks, it didn't start there. He went to sleep in the garden. He ran when Jesus was arrested. He followed him afar off. He sat outside by the fire of the enemies of Christ and warmed his hands and talked about the situation with them. So when the pressure came, he was so far away from the principles he ought to have been living by, he had no hope. Now apply that to every area of your life. Apply that into your relationship with the preacher. Preachers have faults. We make mistakes. We have weak moments. You can pick those up and start criticizing, and you can build on that. And when you criticize, all of a sudden you can get against him, and one thing can lead to another until all of a sudden you're way out in left field. Okay? You can do it with your friends. Just start talking about them, and then one thing. David's heart smote him just cutting off his robe. There is such a principle of life there. An alcoholic doesn't become an alcoholic one day. He starts sipping, drinking a beer. It's all right. It doesn't hurt anybody, but one leads to two, and then two leads to six, and then six leads to a case. A guy that commits adultery or a lady that commits adultery doesn't start like that. First of all, you look, and then you talk, and then you talk more seriously, and then you talk longer, and then all of a sudden, one thing leads to another. Okay? I've never talked to anybody that said, oh, Jerry, I just minded my business one day, and I walked in and robbed a bank. It doesn't work that way. And David was such a great man, he realized that. Okay? Here's some principles. Was Saul wrong? Yes. Was David right in his attitude toward God? Yes. Had David been wronged? Yes. Was it David's job to revenge Saul? No. Okay? Look at verse 7. So David stayed his servants with these words, and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way. Stop there. Let me give you another principle. The word suffered is the same word that's used in Isaiah 53:5 when the Bible said he was wounded for our transgressions. David had to wound his servants with these words. You know what? When David didn't kill him, some of those guys said, David, we'll do it. And David said, no, we're going to do it. No, you can't do it. Listen, he is God's anointed. And all of a sudden, David has a lot of trouble keeping those 600 men from avenging the one that's trying to kill them. He not only did right, he stood for right against others. Now let me give you another thought. Revenge is not only your responsibility, it is not your right to let somebody else revenge you. You see what I'm saying? You say, well, I wouldn't want to do it myself, but if you did it, it would tickle me to death. No, that's not right either. Okay? Aren't these pleasant times? Okay. It is sometimes hard to convince those around you to let you do right. Sometimes the worst enemy you have are your friends who are egging you on. But let me give you another principle. This is principle morning, isn't it? So many people at your job, at your school, you folks that are teachers or coaches or wherever you work, there are so many kids, people at your job who know you're a Christian, who are watching you, wanting you to slip up so they can justify what they do because you did it. Psychologists say 7 people every day make some decision about their life based upon watching you. these guys are trying to get David to do it, but down deep in their heart, they know he's a man of God, and they're wondering, will he do it? Because if he'll do that type of thing, it justifies them. If you gossip, if you get revenge, it justifies others to do the same thing. Okay? Few things in this life are more infectious and instructive than a godly lifestyle. Truman Dollar, my friend in Kansas City, tells about a man in his church that got saved that worked for Kansas City Power and Light. And he got so convicted after he got saved about everything that he had stolen from the company that he went out in his backyard and took his pickup and loaded everything he'd ever stole from the company and took it back. And his supervisor was, number one, astounded, and number two said, I don't know what to do with that. And he said these strange words. He said, in our company, we are so equipped to write off things that are stolen, but we have no mechanism to deal with something that's brought back. And he said to him, why don't you just take it back home and keep it? And the guy said, no, I'm not going to do it. Because I stole it, it's not mine, I'm going to unload it here, and you can do whatever you want to with it. But the guy expected it to be done and didn't have any mechanism to deal with somebody that would do right. Strange criteria of this world in which we live. David did the right thing. Now let me give you a scripture. We're kind of running out of time, and I want to finish this. Would you just make a note of this, maybe right there in the margin of your Bible? Proverbs 16:7. Listen to the quote. Just write P-R-O-V period 16 verse 7. When a man's ways please the Lord. Stop there. Listen. When a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. When a man's ways please the Lord, even his enemies will be at peace with him. All right, go to verse 8. When Saul left the cave, David also rose afterward and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, saying, My Lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. Something you ought to learn. There is a certain dignity and respect about this office that I hold. I may not always do everything right, and I'm not always going to do everything right, but the office in which I hold is an office of dignity. Same thing's true of the President of the United States, same thing's true of your congressman, same thing's true of your mayor, same thing's true of your city councilman, same thing's true of your policeman, same thing's true of the school teacher. It's not a sign that we who are in responsible positions will always do the right thing, but you better teach your children and you better yourself respect the office. Saul was wrong, but he was still king, and David bowed down to him. Now there's a principle of life we need. Then David begins to speak. Verse 9. Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, Behold, David seeketh thy hurt. Oh, wow. He said, Saul, you listen to other people, and it's not true what they say about me. Behold, this day thine eyes have seen how that the Lord had delivered thee today into my hand in the cave. And some bade me kill thee, but mine eyes spared thee. And I said, I will not put forth mine hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the skirt of thy robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe and kill thee not. Know thou and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in mine hand, and I have not sinned against thee, yet thou huntest my soul to take it. The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. There's the principle. The Lord will deal with it, but I will not touch you. Verse 13, as saith the proverb of the ancients, wickedness proceedeth from the wicked, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. After whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom dost thou pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? The Lord therefore be judge, and judge between me and thee, and see, and plead my cause, and deliver me out of thine hand. Just a couple things I want you to notice. Number one, David declared the truth. If you've got an enemy, why don't you go say the truth? Second, David told Saul, he didn't tell others. We're so tempted to tell everybody else our grievance against the one we're grieved. If you got something that you don't understand about me, come tell me. Don't tell everybody else in the church. If you got some other friend or some kinfolk, go tell them. And he offered physical proof. You don't always have that, but if you do, offer it. And then notice what Saul did. He repented. When a man's ways please the Lord, even his enemies are at peace. It came to pass when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, Is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said unto David, Thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil. And thou hast showed this day that thou hast dealt well with me. Forasmuch as when the Lord had delivered me into thine hand, thou killest me not. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore the Lord reward thee good for that thou hast done unto me this day. And now behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand. Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord, that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. Saul repented. Now stop there. Let me give you some thoughts. First of all, I can't promise you that when you go to the person that did you wrong and said, look, I'd like to clear the air, and this and this and this and this is true, I cannot promise you that what Saul did they will do, but I can promise you, you cleared your conscience, and that's the thing that matters. You've done the right thing, and that's important. So do that. People do not always listen. If they refuse to listen, it may be impossible for you to change their opinion, but you've cleared your own conscience. Then Saul made two requests after he'd repented of his evil. Now, I'll confess to you now, it was a temporary repentance, but it sure made an impression upon him, and David did the right thing. And Saul made two requests. Number one, he recognized David's future kingship. He said, I know you're going to be king. I know God's anointed you king. And number two, he said, would you spare my family? Do you understand why he said that? In the old days, when a new king came up, all the old kings got wiped out. I mean, all the old king and his family. Anybody that could be somebody could rally around in a revolt against the present king, they just killed them all. And he said, would you spare my family? And David did. In fact, we're going to get to it later, so I'm not going to take time to do it now. But when we get to 2 Samuel chapter 9, one of the most beautiful stories in the Bible is a crippled son of Saul named Mephibosheth that David found and brought and let him set at his table as his own son because of Saul, and primarily Jonathan, his friend. Interesting. Now, okay, you say, hey, that's really great. Peace is established. Well, let me give you one other little thought to live by. When someone's character is such as they continually do you wrong, you do right, but remember their character. Verse 22. And David sware unto Saul, and Saul went home. But David and his man gat them up unto the hold. You'll notice David didn't go home with Saul. Now there are times in people's character that they'll do you wrong. You don't get revenge. You clear the air. But sometimes you also ought to keep your distance until the character straightens out and you can deal with them peaceably. David had enough sense to realize that. He didn't go home with Saul because he knew Saul's character. He let Saul go home by himself. And he and his men got to the hold, and pretty soon Saul's chasing them again. But that's not David's responsibility. David's responsibility is to do right. And that's your responsibility.